Soulsborne narratives are what they are. They're always very subtextual and abstract and encourage the player to use their imagination to put the pieces of the puzzle together in a way that integrates many disparate narrative elements, and even then lots of things are never explicitly confirmed and are left for interpretation. For some, that can be very frustrating, and I understand why it would feel tedious to be forced to go out of your way, theorycraft, and look up information just to understand what the story is telling you. But luckily for me, I love it and deeply enjoy this sort of thing, just as long as the characters, lore, and setting are captivating, which they almost always are. Now, I started playing Sekiro for the first time during the holiday season of 2022 going into 2023, and it was the only game from the series that I had not yet played. I kept putting it off, knowing that it would likely be a huge departure given the bits I'd seen and heard about it, and it felt pretty intimidating as a result. And while I do wish that I'd gotten to it sooner, I'm really glad that it ended up being the last one that I played to date because of those reasons. While still remaining loyal to the series, it is definitely extremely different in many ways and feels a little bit detached and distinct. Not just in terms of the phenomenal gameplay, which is vastly unlike anything else in the series, but in terms of the story, which is told quite differently as well. Now, of course, I don't want to imply that this game's narrative style is suddenly Naughty Dog or something. It very much has the classic Soulsborne trappings, and there is tons that rely on implication, theorizing, and deep reflection. But while one could go through the entirety of Bloodborne or Elden Ring without really properly understanding core plot points without going the extra mile to look into it, I think that Sekiro front-loads a lot of the fundamentals. We are straight up told about the mystical, double-edged power of the Divine Heir's bloodline, about the war and the external looming threat, about the internal political strife within Ashina as a result, and all the relevant characters' consequent motives and places in the situation. And I don't know about you guys, but for me that was a hell of a lot of information that I wasn't used to having been handed to me in these games. But the most intriguing and unique thing about this story to me, at least within the realms of this series, is the character focus put on our main protagonist. The wolf, also known as Sekiro, is quiet, reserved, and stoic. Nothing about his personality is particularly striking from the outset and in a vacuum, and he could be mistaken as a generic silent protector totally indistinct from the usual Soulsborne protagonist outside of some extra voice work from the amazing Daisuke Namikawa, at least for the Japanese audio. But as is always the case, character writing is contextual. Hidden beneath what may seem like a bland protagonist is a genuinely fragmented, tortured soul who is woken up from a purposeless stupor in the beginning and seeks agency, identity, and salvation. And he finds it, in one way or another, regardless of which ending you uncover. In the description, I will link an excellent video by SMB detailing an interpretation of the wolf's journey as a struggle with and response to PTSD. I won't get into the nitty-gritty details and would instead direct you to that video, but I think it's an extremely valid, well-informed interpretation, and I think it's a framework from which we can extract extreme meaning from the journey of the wolf. Regardless of whether or not you think he's suffering from PTSD specifically, what is clear is that he is deeply damaged externally and especially internally. He was found, you could even say born in terms of his narrative journey, in blood and death, and taken in by someone who, despite having a connection of some sort to him as displayed through his pride upon being defeated by him, ultimately never properly cared for the wolf. The owl bound him to this iron code and made it so that the wolf had to listen to him first and foremost, and his master second. He raised him as a shinobi to be a tool, and is explicitly said to have executed a trial by fire that Sekiro had to complete to even have lived past his adolescence. And we see that in the events 3 years prior to the game, in the attack from the Interior Ministry on the Ashina clan to extract Kudo, he faked his death, and I believe that he was fully willing to let Sekiro die in order to weaken Lady Butterfly if it meant that it would make his journey to taking the dragon's heritage easier and more feasible. I don't believe that he knew that Sekiro would show up, but once he did, he was going to send him to his death for his own means. And I'm also 99% sure that he stabbed him after the Lady Butterfly battle too, in order to obtain Kudo. Some speculate about why the owl did not take the divine heir after this, but a theory I've seen that I personally agree with is that Kudo can likely only bestow his divine power by choice. It makes sense as to why Kudo is not taken, and the thematics tie everything together nicely as well for reasons we'll get to in a bit. But either way, after being stabbed, the wolf is bestowed the blessing of immortality by Kudo, branded as a traitor by Ashina at large for the attack despite it not being his doing, and left with no recollection of the traumatic events. And just as it was on the battlefield, he is once again left alone, aimless, wasting away. That is, until Emma comes to him with a summons, telling him that his master needs him to be his savior, and eventually to change the face of the world and put the curse of the divine heir's bloodline to rest. This provides him with a purpose, and we see a burgeoning amount of heart slowly blossom within him. He gradually starts to find himself through using his sword to protect that which he cares for, and though he isn't free of his trauma, these are little but substantial steps. But he dies early on to Genichiro, and that is key, because due to this, it is an objective fact that he wouldn't be able to embark on this quest without his immortality to then end the line of dragon's heritage that brings about this darkness of man, this decay and bloodshed. There are different types of immortality in Sekiro, but the one that is coveted by the owl is this one, rather than the type that Genichiro obtained through drinking the rejuvenating waters, which is implied to lead to mania and who knows what else. As we discussed, it is a possibility that Kudo was only able to bestow this blessing upon the wolf because he wanted him to have it, and that was the only way in which it can be passed on. Kudo sees in the wolf someone to confide in and trust. And this is key to understanding this journey, because through this framework, in all but the quote-unquote bad endings, Kudo's judgment is rewarded as the wolf follows through and is able to make a personal breakthrough by casting aside the cold and cruel Iron Code in service of his heart. His compassion and connections and care shine through here, and he is rewarded as a result. Now, of course, the divine power of the dragon is very much a double-edged sword that leads to stagnation, rot, and conflict, and the ultimate goal of Kudo is to eliminate it from the world, but as a means to a harmonious end, it is essential for Sekiro to have the gift of rebirth. And Sekiro obtains the means to that end through his genuine bond and maintains it through breaking his chains, moving past his trauma and conditioning, and carving his own path.
できませぬ、源一郎殿。たとえひとたび敗れるとも、命を賭し、主を必ず取り戻す。それが我が忍びなれば。
The most pivotal moment of the game for the wolf is the choice about either obeying the Iron Code and betraying Kudo, Emma, and Ishin through siding with his father, or going against his father and protecting those he has pledged himself to thus far. And in doing the latter, he makes gigantic strides in becoming his own person, doing what he thinks is right and taking steps towards moving past his trauma. If the player gathers information on how to keep Kudo alive while ending the blessing, they come upon an alternative interpretation of the events of the night 3 years ago. And this memory is odd. People that the wolf has killed this night are alive, for instance, and the whole thing is marred by this feeling of strangeness as he makes his way through and confronts his father. But my thoughts on this more or less align with a Reddit post made by Tricky Dickflix on the topic. The plot purpose of this memory is to show us that the owl colluded with the Ministry to extract Kudo and obtain his power while we awakening Ashina, a mutually beneficial arrangement. And the character purpose of this is linked to the bizarre nature of events here. It doesn't make sense sequentially for these people to be alive in the second memory, and it doesn't make sense for the wolf to have killed the owl in this memory. So I believe what is surmised in that post that I referenced, that the bell allows us to see the owl's point of view of those events, but the Buddha allows the wolf to enforce himself upon abstract versions of skewed events for the sake of personal breakthrough. Here he is able to defeat his father in his prime, not in reality in the traditional sense of the word, but in his mind. And that is emblematic of him overcoming the hold his father and his past trauma have on him, and becoming his own person as he takes on the last stretch of his difficult path. This didn't literally happen. It happened in Sekiro's mind and experiences, but it is no less real through what it helps Sekiro to accomplish internally, and through how it empowers him for the final hurdles. In the Immortal Severance ending, the wolf kills Kuro to end the bloodline, as Kuro wished. The wolf is then left forlorn afterwards, and takes on the sculptor's role, waiting to give the prosthetic arm to the next generation, implying that this did not end the cycle. And this regression makes sense, as achieving this ending does not involve going back and killing the owl in his memory. In the Purification ending, the wolf sacrifices himself with courage and conviction, embodying his own personal wishes and ending his life on his own terms, although some think that this may not be as permanent as he hoped. In the Return ending, commonly thought of as the true one, Kuro is absorbed by the Divine Child, and they and the wolf go on a journey to put a stop to it once and for all. However, if he sticks with his father's code, the wolf ultimately embodies Shura, a demonic, sadistic entity of malice and spite, as literal an embodiment of the darkness and agony that trauma and abuse can bring about when not dealt with as anything else. Those who become Shura are taken hold of by a manic bloodlust, and the ending of Sekiro here, the deaths of Emma and Ishin and the pain of Kuro, and the devastation that this brings upon Ashina, is an external manifestation of what comes about through cycles of embedded, inflicted torment if the cycle is never broken. Destruction is inevitable and will always spring up again in this case. Now, as I alluded to, only in the ending where the wolf defeats his father in the memory does he find true freedom of agency and purpose, with perhaps remote but hopefully substantial ambitions of putting an end to this blessing that brings about such agony. Only through combating the ghost that terrorized him does he find the path to salvation in life. And through this and his battles, the wolf gains more confidence, illustrated by the huge difference between his demeanor prior to the first and last Genichiro battles. Whereas before he was still conditioned to expect the whip, here he is confident, having broken his chains. Yet, if he remains bound, it builds up until he becomes a god of destruction, a demon, in a development that I believe betrays his true heart for reasons that I think are clear given the other endings. I don't think he ever would have wanted this, but this is a wolf that was not able to act genuinely, and this is a wolf who remained caged. Sekiro is a story of someone moving on from the pain of horrific experiences, or succumbing to it, and the nuances associated with that dynamic. It can end in anguish, or it can end in a way that is as empowering for the wolf as it feels for the player when they take down Ishin. It will spell a quiet hush and the serene beginnings of a new, hopefully harmonious era, or it will mean that Ashina is razed to the ground through this devil born from pain. And yet, regardless of which path is taken, Sekiro is in many ways a thoughtful, meticulous, and metaphorical story with as much love and quality put into the narrative as was put into the more heavily discussed combat. This is the Soulsborne series' one and only character study, and it is a phenomenon. Many thanks for watching.
最後の不死を成敗いたす。人として生きてくだされ。